A couple other points to consider. We really recommend that you do not use any older recipes that have been in existence before 1994. At that date, the USDA did a major upgrade in their recommendations for home canning. So any recipes that are older than 1994 should not be used anymore. Recipes that have been passed down through the family, yes, they may have been successful for you, but sometime sooner or later, those are probably going to catch up to you. Another point is making up your own recipes and attempting to can them by taking any processing time from a similar recipe that might be in one of these books. That can really be dangerous because you're making up a random mixture of ingredients that you don't know what the acidity is or how thick that product is going to be and how that's going to affect the heat to go through it, many other factors. The best recommendation that we can tell you for homemade recipes is to just eat them fresh or to freeze them for later use. And many of these products can be frozen. The other resources that we're concerned about you using is unverified recipes, such as recipes that are on personal blogs or on any social media websites. Those recipes could be just homemade recipes, and you really don't know if they've been thoroughly tested for safety. So it's best to avoid those and just stick to any of these recipes here, and you'll end up with a safe product. It's salsa time, and today we're going to make a really easy salsa for you to enjoy by canning it, and you can have it for later use. Salsa is probably one of the most popular things that people like to can at home, but what a lot of people don't remember is that any kind of mixture that you put together for your own fresh salsa cannot necessarily be canned safely. So today we're going to talk about the reasons why. Today's recipe is really easy. It uses onions, and it uses a variety of peppers. It uses tomatoes, ground pepper, salt, and lemon juice. So let's talk about these different ingredients. To start off with, onions, you can use whatever kind of onion that you would like. So if you want to put in a red onion or use white or yellow onions, you can do that. On the peppers, you can use any variety of pepper, and that will give you some control on how hot or how mild you would like your salsa to be. So this mixture today is a mixture of bell peppers, jalapeno peppers, poblano peppers, and a serrano pepper, just to kick up the heat. And then for tomatoes, today we're using plum tomatoes, and these types of tomatoes are less juicy than your larger slicing type tomatoes, so you'll end up with just a little bit thicker salsa. Ground pepper is your standard ground pepper. Salt, we're using canning salt today, and in any kind of canning, this is pure salt, and this works for pickles or any other type of canned produce that you would like to make. And then for the acid, we're using lemon juice. Now, you could use the option of vinegar. If a recipe calls for vinegar, you could use lemon or lime juice in place of that. And you want to use bottled lemon or lime juice because it has a consistent acid content. So for the amounts for this recipe, and this is a tested recipe, we encourage people to use tested recipes in order to get a safe salsa in the end. For the onions, this recipe calls for 1 pound of onions. It calls for 2 pounds of peppers, and it calls for 5 pounds of tomatoes. For the seasonings, it calls for a half a teaspoon of pepper, 3 teaspoons of salt, and then for the lemon juice, we're using 1 cup. So let's talk about how do we prepare these vegetables. As you can see, I have these chopped up for you, but I'm going to show you an easy way to peel your tomatoes. I'm going to show you how to easily peel your tomatoes so that you don't have to use a knife to get the peeling off. The only time you have to use a knife is to get the stem off the tomatoes. So we'll just cut that off. Over here, I have a pan of hot water cooking on the stove, and you just drop your tomatoes in the hot water. And what this will do is soften up the skin, and it only takes about 30 to 60 seconds. And this is long enough for the peels to soften on the outside of the tomato. And then after they've been in here, and I've had some in here for about 60 seconds now, you take them out and you put them in ice water so that it stops the cooking process, cools them off, and makes them a lot easier to handle. And the peel will just slip right off. How easy they peel also makes a difference on how ripe your tomatoes are. If they're a little underripe, the peel is going to be a little bit harder to come off. But it definitely saves a lot of time. All right. So now we're ready to chop up some of our vegetables. So we'll start with the tomatoes, and one tool that I found is really easy to use is this chopper. There's many ways to chop up your vegetables. You could just use a regular knife and cutting board, such as I have here, or you can use one of these handy choppers. You could use a food processor, but you want to be very careful with that because you can incorporate a lot of air in your tomatoes. And it's hard to get that air out. And if you have too much air in your salsa mixture, that can stay trapped in the jar, and it could cause seal failure on your canning jars. So there we have our tomatoes getting chopped, and see how fast that goes. All right, we'll stop at that one. Now, for onions, you can do the same thing. If you're using a chopper like this, you want to cut your onion up into chunks. You could also replace some of your onions with garlic and add a little zest that way by using some garlic. I'll cut this part of the onion yet. Now for peppers, these are jalapeno peppers. If you have trouble handling hot peppers or your skin is sensitive, you will want to use some plastic gloves. This will help protect your skin, and especially you don't want to touch your face or your eyes after you've been handling hot peppers. So you want to cut the stem off of those. You can remove the inside of the peppers. This is another way to control the heat on peppers. I'll slice this in half. You can take out the membranes and the seeds. That's where a lot of the heat is in hot peppers. And the compound that causes the heat is called capsaicin. Peppers are rated on what's called the Scoville unit scale. Mild peppers, such as bell peppers, are rated at a 0. And then when you get into the hot peppers, like a jalapeno or a habanero pepper, that gets up into the hundreds of thousands of Scoville units. So the hotter the pepper, obviously the hotter your salsa. And so we'll chop up our pepper just like that. So that makes it go really quickly.
Trust Rogers & Associates Insurance to keep your peace of mind through all the seasons in life. Whether you're cozy at home memory making with your family, on an outdoor adventure with the top down, floating on a boat, or in the middle of harvest, we can customize an insurance plan that's perfect for you. For all the seasons, we've got you covered. Call us or visit us online to learn more today.
So now we're ready to put all our ingredients together for our salsa and cook it. We have to heat up our salsa for 10 minutes before we can put it in the jars. And this would be what we would call a hot pack, and that's what is typically done for any kind of salsa. So we'll combine all our ingredients, and again, this is 5 pounds of chopped tomatoes, 2 pounds of a variety of peppers. And again, you can use any variety, any however hot you want it, any color of peppers. 1 pound of chopped onions. And again, you can use any kind of onion, and you could also use some garlic in place of the onion if you like. 1 cup of lemon juice. You could also use vinegar in place of this, or you could even use bottled lime juice if you like that flavor. Again, on recipes that you have, if your recipe calls for vinegar and you don't like vinegar, you can replace that with lemon or lime juice. But if your recipe calls for lemon or lime juice, you cannot replace it with the vinegar because the acidity is too different, and you would actually have to use more vinegar than the recipe calls for. So this is our 3 teaspoons of salt and our ½ teaspoon of ground pepper. And we'll stir this up. And we'll place it on our burner. And we can turn the heat up to high. And we'll put the lid on, and then this needs to come up to a boil and boils for 10 minutes. Our salsa has cooked for 10 minutes, so now we can put it into our canning jars. So I'll move the salsa over here. In this small pot, I have the canning lids that I've heated up just to a gentle simmer. You do not want to boil these lids because the sealing compound could get too soft around the inside of the lid, and then you may have a lid failure during the canning process. So you just need to have it at just a warm simmer, or you don't have to heat them at all. You could just leave them as they are and use them right out of the box. You'll need a jar lifter, and this is an example of a jar lifter. The black part has a solid hard plastic handles, and then the blue part is a rubber coated wire to help get a good grip on your jars. You want to make sure you use the rubber part on the jars so that you don't drop them. If you use it this way, you'll probably most likely drop your jars. So inside of our canner over here, we've been heating up our jars. And it's always a good idea to heat up your jars so that they're nice and warm. And we'll take them out one at a time to fill them. And we'll use a funnel to help get the salsa into the jars so that we don't lose any along the way. And you want to fill the jar until it's almost full. One thing that we need to measure is what's called the headspace. And the headspace is the area between the top of the food and the top of the jar. And the headspace is important to pull a good vacuum on the jar during the canning process. If there's too much or too little headspace, your lid may not seal. So for salsa, what we need to have is a 1/2 inch headspace. So first of all, I'm going to use my bubble freer and move the salsa around to make sure that we get out any air bubbles that might be trapped inside the salsa. And then we can measure our headspace with this tool. And we need a 1/2 inch, which is right here. So this will set right on the rim, and you can see that I still need to put a little more salsa in there. So we'll get a little more out of our pot. Fill that up a little more, maybe just a little bit more. All right, let's take a measurement one more time. And I'm right on the nose. All right, at this point, we're ready to put our lids on. Our lids have been heating in the water over here, just at a gentle warm simmer. You do not want to boil the lids because that could soften the sealing compound too much, and the lids may not seal. You could also leave the lids alone and not heat them up at all. The manufacturer says that it's not a necessary step, but I think it's a good idea to do that. Before you put the lids on, you want to take a paper towel, wipe off the rim of the jar to make sure it's clean and there's no food debris on there. Take a lid out of our pot, and I'm using a what's called a lid wand, which is basically a handle with a magnet on the end of it. And that helps prevent you from touching the lid so you don't contaminate it. So we've got our lid on our jar. Now we're ready to put a ring on. And the rings only need to go on just until what we call finger tight, which is basically when it stops. If you screw the ring down too much or really hard during the canning process, the lids could buckle, and that could prevent the jar from sealing. So again, you only need to screw it down just until the ring stops moving. And at this point, we're ready to put our jars into our canner. All right, we've got our jars filled, and now we're ready to put them into our canner so that we can process them. First thing I want to do is put a little bit of vinegar in our canner water, which we've had heating. You want to fill it about half full of water, and then we may need to add some more water once we get the jars in there. I want to put about 1/4 cup of vinegar in here, and that's to help prevent hard water deposits from sticking to the sides of the jars, and it helps clean up your canner. Makes a really easy cleaning process. All right, so I've moved my rack up so that it sets on the curved part of the handle. It makes it a little easier to put the jars into the canner. And then one by one, we'll just set them on the rack. And you want to leave a little bit of space in between the jars so that the water circulates around the jars completely. The rack inside the canner helps keep the jars off of the bottom of the canner. If you set them directly on the bottom without a rack, your jars could end up cracking, and then you'll have a large mess inside of your canner. Once you get the jars onto the rack, you can lower it back down into the water. We want to make sure that the water is completely covering the jars at least 1 to 2 inches. And you may have to add extra hot water to reach that level. So you need to have an extra pan or a tea kettle with some hot water boiling, and then pour it on top of the jars. You can use a ruler and measure how much how much water you have. And it needs to be at least 1 to 2 inches. After that, we're ready to put our lid on. and then it'll need to come back up to a full rolling boil. It just needs to bubble throughout the whole process. Once it gets to that point, we time this for 20 minutes. At this point, the timing is affected by your altitude of residence. You have to adjust for your altitude so that the product gets processed properly. So for boiling water bath canning, we add time to what the recipe calls for. So for our chili salsa recipe, for 0 to 1,000 feet, it calls for 15 minutes of processing time. Today, we are in Manhattan, Kansas, and we are just above 1,000 feet. So we have to add 5 minutes to the processing time. So our total time will be 20 minutes. Our water is just about to a boil. Actually, it is at a boil, so I'm going to set my timer for 20 minutes. And we'll let it process.
The team at Homestead Assisted Living is a proud supporter of the Hayes community. Located just west of the Sternberg Natural History Museum, Homestead is a warm and welcoming community where residents receive compassionate care from licensed professionals. If you're curious about senior living options for yourself or a loved one, make Homestead your first call. Our kind and courteous staff would love to show you around and answer any questions you may have. Call us today to schedule a tour of Homestead or visit us online at homesteadofhayes.com.
What a girl wants in her home kitchen. Ease of use, flexibility, fun, the latest kitchen design, Frigidaire Professional Real Stainless Steel for fewer finger smudges, a French door refrigerator, convection cooking, and quiet dishwasher. Have the staff at Genuine Appliance in Hayes demonstrate new Frigidaire gallery appliances to find what you want. Genuine Appliance at 1224 East 27th Street in Hayes. Everything a girl wants.
So our 20-minute process time is done on our salsa. So we'll turn the burner off and remove the canner lid. And at this point, we need to wait another 5 minutes and leave the jars in the canner. This helps the steam get out of the way, lets the water calm down, and it's an extra insurance that your jars are going to seal. So our 5 minutes is up. And now we can remove our jars from the canner. As you're removing the jars from the canner, you want to try to keep them straight up and down and not tip them. Don't worry about the water that's on top of the jars. That will eventually evaporate. You don't want to tip them at this point because the lids are now trying to seal onto the jars. And if you tip them too much, the food inside the jar could get in between that seal, and then you'll have a lid failure on your jars. So you want to take them out, put them onto a towel or a cooling rack, and you'll want to let them cool undisturbed. You want to keep them away from any drafts or your air conditioner or a fan, and you'll let them cool completely for 12 to 24 hours. Even if the rings become a little bit loose during the process time, don't adjust them at this point because you could move the lid too much and they may not seal. So just let them sit still for 12 to 24 hours and your process is completed. After you've processed your jars of salsa, you can store it in a cool, dry, dark location. Either in a cabinet or a pantry would be ideal. Anywhere that's away from any kind of wide temperature ranges. You especially don't want to store it by a hot water heater or your dryer or even out in the garage. Temperature changes can really affect the flavor, the color, and the safety of your products. You can leave the rings on, or you can take them off. After you've canned your jars, it's always a good idea to take the rings off, clean them clean the rims and the screw area on the jars so that if you do leave the rings on, they don't get rusty and they won't stick to the jars. But you can leave them completely off too, because you may need the rings for something else. When you're ready to use your salsa, this is the time where you can add any other ingredients that you would like to, such as black beans or corn or any herbs like fresh cilantro. That way you can add extra flavor and nutrition to your salsa. So we'll pour this into a bowl and we'll add a can of black beans or a few black beans, maybe not all of them, and then stir it up and then it's ready to serve.